Good morning, everyone. I now call the meeting to order. Before we commence, may I remind members participating remotely that they must do so from within the precincts of Leinster House. I'm pleased today to continue our discussion of the priority item on the committee's work programme, which is our continued consideration of the proposed National Action Plan on the development for the islands from the Department of Community and Rural Development. The coastal islands and communities are a crucial part of our history and heritage. Our committee wants to hear the voice of islanders and get their opinion on what is needed to stop population decline, reduce the downward trend and build and sustain vibrant communities. Key issues that will be discussed include vital transport and social infrastructure needed by islands, including education, childcare, transport, housing and broadband, and key supports needed for industry like tourism, fishing and farming. In this regard, I'd like to welcome board members of Comhdháil, Oileáin and hÉireann for our second engagement with the Federation, and in particular welcome joining us remotely Ms Aisling Moran Cathaoirleach from Sherkin Island, Mr Simon Murray from Inishbofin and Mr John Walsh from Bear Island. You're all very welcome. Before we commence, and in terms of privilege, witnesses are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or to make him, her or it identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction. For witnesses participating remotely and from outside the precincts of Leinster House today, you are reminded that parliamentary privilege does not apply in your case, and the same level of caution should be applied as previously mentioned. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Ms Aisling Moran to make her opening statement. Aisling.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks for your opening comments on the islands and the National Action Plan. We're very welcome. We very much welcome your comments on it. The Board of Comhdháil and hÉireann, Rapporteur, Deputy Senators and officials of the Joint Committee, the opportunity to highlight some of the challenges facing offshore islands is very much appreciated today. And this is, as the Chairman stated, our second appearance before yourselves. We welcome our Rural Futures, the policy document, and especially Chapter 10 that deals in supporting the sustainability of our islands and coastal communities. For those of you, just a quick recap who don't know, Comhdháil, Oileáin and hÉireann was founded in 1984 and represents the offshore inhabited islands. The organisation's aim is the social, economic and cultural developments of the island communities through representation at a local, national and EU levels. Comhdháil, Oileáin and hÉireann's overarching aim is to maintain and develop the islands, and that's in line with our Rural Futures policy document. And just on that, islands have much in common. However, it's important to remember that there are many nuances and bespoke approaches may be needed for certain challenges. My name is Aisling Moran and I'm here representing Islanders as the Chair of Comhdháil, Oileáin and hÉireann. I'm the Project Coordinator for Sherkin Island Development Society and act as an island advocate. For the past decade, I've spent working with islands seeking comprehensive means to live sustainably on our offshore islands. Simon Murray, one of my colleagues here, is from Inishbofin, and John Walsh from Bear Island. And Simon has spent his entire life working with and for island communities, ensuring key concerns are continuously addressed. And many of you will know him from this continual addressing of key concerns of the islands. John Walsh is the Project Manager for Bear Island Projects Group, and he's also the Chair of the European Small Islands Federation, which is also known as ESAN, and an Islands Advocate. We feel at Comhdháil, Oileáin and hÉireann, we feel it's necessary to reiterate the shocking population statistics just at the start of our opening statement. In 1841, there was 34,219 people living on our offshore islands. Just remember that number, 34,000. By 2016, we had 2,627. So no other community in Ireland has experienced such a decline, and that is pointed out within the National Action Plan. And these figures have not improved, and some islands have moved closer to the edge. So serious and continued government support is needed to ensure the long-term viability of our offshore islands. We can see the way this trend is going. We can see, if it continues, where we're going to be in 20 years, 30 years' time. So today, Comhdháil would like to highlight 4 areas of concern, and if the time allows, address other areas as Chairman Naughton addressed also. The first area of concern for us today would be housing. So the social context in how we live has disproportionately impacted our housing situation on the islands. The updated laws on policy and planning limit the ability of islanders to be able to actually build on their island. Ireland as a whole has seen an increase in second home ownership, and this demand has just driven the price of island housing, existing housing stock, out of the reach of islanders. And like no other area, islands are finite spaces. Therefore, our islanders need to be able to either afford to build or buy homes on the islands. And alternative mainland housing solutions options are not a solution to the island housing crisis at all. So the island housing situation in offshore islands, it is really urgent, and it is an area where there's been very little research carried out to date. So University College Cork, in conjunction with Corn and Oileáin and Comhdháil hÉireann, are currently engaged to conduct a comprehensive housing survey on all of the offshore islands, inhabited islands. And the outcomes of this survey will result in a report and housing recommendations for the offshore islands. In September 2022, Comhdháil we wish to host our AGM, and the main theme of our AGM will be based on housing and on this report. And you're all welcome to attend that, and invites will go out at a later stage. But Comhdháil is hoping that this report will input into our rural futures, as one of the policy measures is, the 10-year island policy document, and it will input into that as well, and that this will be substantial, a substantial research document with evidence backing it. The second area that we need to look at, and again, Chairperson Naughton touched on this, is connectivity and broadband. The last 2 years have been challenging and very different for the whole world, and islanders are no different. And throughout one of the main results of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is that people want to and sometimes must work from home. And there's a new range of age of remote working already building in Ireland. And Comhdháil and hÉireann really do see this as an opportunity for islanders to both attract emigrant islanders and new residents to the islanders. To do this, we need sufficient housing, but we also need reliable high-speed broadband systems in place. And as we stated in our previous presentation to the committee, in exploring the opportunities for GTEC and BCPs and enterprise hubs in our communities, it is vital that the National Broadband Plan provide islands with fibre optic cables connections from the mainland. We have to be staying in step with the mainland the whole way, all the way up along. If we look at the current situation, the National Action Plan, our Rural Futures document, notes that access to computers is at 58%, broadband 55% on the islands. And this is considerably less than it is on the mainland. So where it's like relatively, it's 73% of the population have access to a household computer and 72% have access to the internet. And while the National Broadband Plan is meant to deliver high-speed broadband to all areas of Ireland, this is slowly being, and it is being developed, and several islands do have broadband connection points and have developed internet hubs that are proven very successful. There's a lot more to be done on this, and it must be done at a faster pace. Because people won't and they can't put businesses and lives on hold waiting for the infrastructure to catch up with the technology that is there. The third area we'd like to speak on today is infrastructure, lifelong services and capital funding. So the Islands Capital Budget Programme funds infrastructure projects, lifeline services and capital works. Comhdháil and hÉireann believe that there is definite scope for an increase in this budget to reflect the real needs of the offshore islands. From our Rural Future document, the government will invest in vital infrastructure on our islands over the lifetime of this policy to ensure safe access to islanders, service providers and visitors alike. But for us, infrastructure is not only about safe access, it is about the everyday lives of islanders and the future sustainability of the islands. So Comhdháil would like to see a consistent budget that could meet the needs of the offshore islands, working in conjunction with the Interdepartmental Committee, island interagency groups, local authorities. The Island Capital Budget Programme is crucial to the sustainability of the offshore islands. The success of the island policy document depends on real financial support and backing through its implementation. The budget has, in the past, proven to cover a wide range of vital areas of island life, integral to the future of the offshore islands. And finally, the last area that we're going to touch on, and it's one of a current debate at the moment, is energy. And we see that sustainable energy, it's the way forward. It's a key consideration for the whole of the country at the moment. And as islands, we want to state that we're really keen to be at the forefront of these new developments. And we're already working, and John Walsh will talk about this a little bit more as well, at an EU level on this through the EU Clean Islands Secretariat. And through the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, there's major potential for offshore islands to work at a local and national level. The recent SAAI National Homes Retrofit Scheme was welcomed. However, this is a key example of where it will not translate to the islands due to the higher cost of works and also the requirements on the contractors. So it would be an example of where island proofing would aid in the understanding of these nuances. It would be hopeful that through the Interdepartmental Committee and the Ministers' engagements that we will get resolution on this. And islands, they definitely are ideal test beds for energy pilot projects. The areas I've touched on today, it's by no means a comprehensive list for the offshore islands. And Comhdháil, we would definitely welcome the expansion of the conversation to include policies around health, education, agriculture, marine access, childcare, enterprise employment, fire and emergency services, waste management, tourism, youth and older people, many of which are looked at within the 12 policy measures of the National Action Plan. And I suppose one of the most important policy measures within this action plan is the 10-year Islands Policy Development Plan that will allow us to expand on all of these areas. So we would like to recognise that by being here before the Oireachtas Joint Committee today, it's a great opportunity, and we can see great potential and great opportunities in us all working together. And we recognise that the work on the Islands Policy document that the Department are doing is central to our rural's futures and is central to our success, our sustainability going into the future. We would like to request that a draft version of this document along with an implementation plan be presented to the island communities before its final publication. And Comhdháil would also like to recognise the real importance of the Interdepartmental Committee in the process of writing the policies document alongside with the department. Comhdháil are grateful for the opportunity to speak before the Joint Oireachtas Committee today, and we see these opportunities as key to the delivery of the government policies, and it will secure the future of Ireland's offshore islands for future generations, and we can turn the tide on those numbers and sustainable living on the islands. I'd like to thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to me here today, and hand it back to Chairperson Naughton.
Thanks very much, Aisling, and thanks for that comprehensive presentation outlining the challenges that are there. So the first member that is indicated is Deputy Eamon O'Keefe.
It's good that you can join us here today, and one thing that has come out of COVID is the ability or the acceptance within this House that we can do things remotely when it's necessary. I have to say that there's a lot of issues raised there today, and we could say a lot about them. I'm appalled at the lack of progress in the last 12 years in relation to islands. Because when I got the figures from the department, allowing the contractuals that have been entered into for Inishmaan was built, and there was some money to still paid, and more was in construction. In the 10 years, 2000 to, well, 11 years, 2000 to 2010, there was 128 million spent on infrastructure for islands. In the 11 years since, there was 12 million spent. So with all the planning, we're not getting delivery. I was looking then at other issues. For example, in 1997, there were only ferry services to Oileáin Islands, and that was a hodgepodge of different systems. That was all unified into one system, and every island with any significant population got a ferry service, irrespective of the lingua franca, whichever language was spoken on the islands. The social welfare allowance was introduced in that period, so that there's an extra allowance per week for people in invalidity pension and pensions. The special island tax on cars was introduced. There was a doctor got for in his ear. Now, that was all done up to 2010, and there were other things done. Since then, the most significant change, positive change I've seen in the islands is the decision that all schools have 2 teachers, which I utterly welcome. But it seems to me that we're not really going forward at the moment. And one of the big concerns I have is that we lose years in all this planning. The plan I had at the time was written in 3 pages of paper, and we just went and did the things. And I'm not boasting because it was done. I'm saying it because, to me, literally, the train stopped with a jolt and it hasn't started again. So there's a few issues I'd like to concentrate on and ask you, are these big issues? Number one, should everybody who lives permanently on an island and doesn't have a home automatically be considered, which there are not in many countries, to have a housing need for the purposes of planning permission for a house? Because very few of the islands have towns on them. So that's number one if we want to talk about housing. And should the local authorities be obliged to house island applicants who want to stay on islands in local authority houses on the islands rather than putting them on lists in the mainland against their wishes? Third thing, do we require affordable houses on the islands so that they would be included in the affordable housing island? Broadband's going to happen. It's happening very slowly at the moment, but it is going to happen. The National Broadband Plan says that you get 30 megabits or more, and I credit the chair here for a lot of work that was done on that. However, the problem is that it doesn't specify a fibre optic cable to each island. So they can give you a radio broadband over 30 megabits and then they're out the gap. I don't think that's acceptable. Now, I'd like to tie this in my next brief point, and that is that, in my experience, there's only one way of dealing with capital deficits on islands, and that is that the island fund of the Department of the Islands is significant, and that the Minister has freedom with that fund. So my belief is, because it's not part of the National Broadband Plan, and therefore MBI have no obligation to put in fibre into every island, my view is that for issues such as putting in the fibre cable, putting in sewage, putting in water, putting in power, new electric connections to the mainland, telecommunication, health facilities, leisure facilities, piers, roads, and anything else that requires a capital input over and above that which would be required on the mainland, or to overcome the cost-benefit problem that Irish Water would say, we're a commercial entity, we have to prioritise things. So if we got somewhere with 1,000 houses on it versus an island, and the cost in the island is more, cost-benefit says it goes to the bottom of the list. Now, the way we overcame that before was the Island Fund put the money in and said, will you contractually agree to run the service, and will you also contractually put in the same amount of money as you would in an equivalent one on the mainland, and we put in the difference. Do you agree that we need to go back to that process of getting the job done with the capital expenditure? So it's not only about money, it's about the freedom to spend that money on any deficit that the Islands Department sees is there, and where people are giving the argument that the cost benefit doesn't justify it. On the energy one, to go to specifics, I understand that you've already looked for a meeting with Minister Ryan, and I've raised the issue with them. Not getting a lot of satisfaction, but I understand your requests are very, very simple. That as before, that the upper limits on the expenditure would be higher there. Now, he did give some hope on that than on the mainland. So the 50,000 would be 60,000 or 65,000 or whatever on an island, because it costs more to do the same thing in terms of materials, etc., on an island and labour. The second one is that the percentage grant rates would be higher. So 50% would become 60% and so on. And the third one is that there wouldn't be a requirement for island-based contractors to have a turnover of 1 million a year. It's hard enough in the mainland, but it's an impossibility, and it'll exclude island contractors. I probably, for this round, said enough. There's a lot more I could say on what you've been saying. But I would just say that when we're looking at drafting our document, we need to continue improving ferry and air services, education, health, fishing, childcare, ambulance and fire service, and all those issues are, nothing should be excluded from what we write. And the fact that we're not going to necessarily discuss everything here today, don't take that as an indication that this committee will not look at all facets of life and come up with cogent proposals in relation to them. I have utmost faith in the committee, and they have the freedom to put whatever they think fit in the report. It doesn't have to be mentioned here today to go in the report, because it's a committee report, if you understand me. It's not just us transmitting what you managed to say in a very short input. Good morning.
So, Ms. Morden, we might start off with you, and if the other witnesses want to come in, then they can pick up on some of the aspects that Deputy O'Keefe has raised.
Hi, apologies there, I was just trying to unmute. Thank you very much, and I appreciate Deputy O'Keefe raising all those issues. I suppose I'll start off, and I'll start off with the housing issue. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Deputy O'Keefe is saying. When you look, everybody on the island that is looking to build or is looking to move into a house does have a housing need, and we have a situation where people, you know, are very graciously and like living with family members, but there's nowhere else for them to live, and sometimes are being told that there isn't a housing need because they're living with brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, cousins, and that's just not it's not sustainable, and it's not acceptable long term. If people are if they want to have their own home and they can do so, then they do have a housing need. One of the biggest issues we do have is, you know, if somebody does make the local authority housing list and there is no housing on the island, they are being offered houses on the mainland. And, you know, we mentioned in our opening statement that islands are finite resources, and we see all the planning that's going in to trying to make islands sustainable. And then when something like this happens, all it's doing is a government policy that's driving islanders off the island, that's giving them an option of, you can have a house, but you can't have it on your island, you can have it on the mainland. And that, again, does not do anything to sustain our populations. You know, if somebody is an islander or wishes to live on the island, then, you know, and are on the local housing list, then the house should be offered to them on the island. And there is definitely a need for an affordable housing system within the islands. We need all people and all sorts living on the islands, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the housing on islands the price has been driven up due to the demands of society, and we do need a system of affordable housing on the islands where, you know, there's hard-working people that want to stay here and that would be willing to build or buy houses, and there definitely is a need. And we're hoping, look, we can't say what the report and what the surveys will bring out over the next couple of months, but we're very, very hopeful that this will give it, that the research will be weighted in terms of that, like it's gone through an ethics board.
instead of us as Comhdháil recognising, and as Deputy O'Keefe says, we recognise that these are solutions, but we'll have academics behind this saying that, well, these are the problems, this is what the survey is showing, and we're very, very much hopeful that we'll be able to, make real requests based on what people want on the island and what the research has proven, and bring that forward to the government for government policies. And that would be our hope going forward into the future, that this committee would look at that, and that Minister Humphreys has already said that she will look at it, and we'll see that hopefully that through the Housing Department as well, that they will look at it. I think with the fund, I might leave that to Simon, and the energy if John wants to look at the energy, and the broadband again. I do agree, and maybe some of my colleagues might want to talk on that. I think that fibre optic broadband has to be going into our islands. Otherwise, by the time we get the radio signal in, we'll already be behind. And this is what's happening: is that we'll get and the National Broadband Plan, you're 100% correct. They're under no obligation to bring fibre into the islands. That's not part of the deal. But we need to get a way to get fibre into our islands, because by the time that the radio signal goes into the islands and goes around to all the houses, I can guarantee we're going to be so far behind the mainland that we'll be back here in 5 or 10 years saying our broadband isn't up to scratch with the mainland. So if you're going to do it now, let's do it right. Let's do it in a manner that can keep us in line with the mainland. And that's just common sense from our point as islanders. I think Simon or John, do you want to come in on the other topics, or even comment on the ones I already commented on?
Yeah, I can come in there, Ashton. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Wadge.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to say again, I do agree with Deputy O'Keefe's points. Just again, talking about fibre broadband, if we end up getting a radio link with 30 megabytes, I'd say in a year's time or 2 years' time, again, we'll be looking for fibre, because I think today we're the only community in Ireland that if we had to attend the meeting today in Leinster House, it would take us 2 overnights. Our first ferry this morning was 8:15, so I wouldn't have made the meeting at 9:30 in Dublin. Our last ferry last night was 6:30. Again, tonight, if I had to get home again, I'd have to make the ferry at 6:30, which wouldn't be very doable from Dublin to get down. So we really need proper broadband, and the only solution that will really future-proof the islands 30 years ahead is fibre broadband. Somebody, like an expert on broadband, said to me one time, the radio link is like a water connection. If there's 1 or 2 people using it, it's very good. If 50 or 60 people start using it at the same time, it's useless. And that's what will happen. Like, we already know 30 megabytes probably wasn't good enough 2 years ago. Never mind 2 years' time, it'll be behind. Again, on the infrastructure, I agree with Deputy O'Keefe's points there. I think in the past it worked. I know my own island here, the islanders were key partners in whatever projects were going ahead. We were partners with the local authority, Cork County Council. We were partners with the Islands Division. It worked very good. I just find lately that there's a small bit of slippage in that, whereas the islanders aren't really getting a say in what's going on. And as Deputy O'Keefe said again, very little is happening, which is disappointing. And I know in Deputy O'Keefe's own constituency, the Pier in Shear is going on with a number of years, and I was there myself, and it's vital infrastructure. I can't understand why that's not done. Under housing, again, there's people, as Aisling said, living with their parents, living in mobile homes. They're the unseen homeless people, as it were. And we're trying to encourage people to live in islands. We're trying to encourage people, young families. I know young families here with young babies living in substandard accommodation. They're actually they don't make enough to get a mortgage, and they make too much to get social housing. So council housing is out for them. What they need is affordable housing, and we need to come up with schemes, and hopefully the study that's gone on at the moment will give us some answers to that. So under energy, just to give you a small update on the European Small Islands Federation, which I'm chairperson of. It was set up in May 2001. There's 11 members ranging from Scotland, France, the Åland Islands, off Finland, right down to Croatia and Greece and Italy. So what we do, we work at a local level, we share best practice, and then we also work at the European level, trying to influence EU policies. So we represent 1,640 islands and about 360,000 islanders. So we have key partnerships built up over the years. like the likes of the CPMR, the Confederation for Maritime Regions, Greening the Islands, Federain, the Federation of Energy Agencies. So we're partners with all of them. So over the years, we're building on our work, and we actually did a lot of work on energy. We were instrumental in setting up the Clean Energy for EU Island Secretariat, and also the facility for funding energy projects for islands called NESI. And we're delighted that Inishbofin in Galway is a benefit of that. And actually the Clean Energy for EU Islands, both Cape Clear and Bear Island and Inishmore were beneficiaries of that. So that secretary is set up to support islands in their energy transition. And I think islands, again, if we can convince Minister Ryan to do something with the islands, again, we're left behind. If we get the same rate as the mainland, it's actually a step behind for us, because on islands, costs are 30 to 40% more. I don't understand why he doesn't do what is done by the Department of Agriculture when it comes to building agricultural sheds, where if a shed is costing, say, just for example, 10,000 on the mainland, they actually add the extra cost, what it costs for an island. So maybe add 30% on. So they say the shed on the island costs 13,000, and then the grant rate stays the same. So that was a way that the Department of Agriculture solved it for islands, and that scheme was successful. There was a lot of buildings built in islands, but we'd welcome a meeting with Minister Ryan on that, because I think if islands don't get their energy plans in order, we're in huge trouble. We recently had a visit from Søren Hermansen, who'd be from the EU Energy Island of Samso, and he was saying, like, for the future of islands, energy is so important that living on islands is already costly enough. There's been 3 increases in energy, as we know, in the last few months. And if that continues, it will actually force people from the islands, because we simply won't be able to live on the islands with the extra costs of energy on top of the extra cost for living on an island. So that's all I have to say for the moment. I'm available to answer any questions. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, do you want to come in?
Yeah, on mute. Chairperson, just on the housing issue, no more than the mainland is a very complicated situation, but in relation to the islands, there's often a case across the islands where turnkey properties are available for sale, and the council never take up these properties. They never purchase them, to solve housing needs across the islands. They always seem to want to go the long road of building or procuring sites, which is, way more costly as a rule. And maybe there's a block there in council rules, but surely it should be changed in relation to the island context where, geographically confined area, there's only so much room on an island for housing in the first place. It's a huge issue because, as Aisling said, if you don't have a situation where people can't live on the islands, well, then everything else, the domino effect from that is that everything else is in the negative, because if you can't maintain your population, everything else starts to fall apart after that. Keeping our communities on the islands is crucial. That's what Comhdháil's main aim is. Hopefully that's what the government's main aim is as well, although sometimes it's questionable. Just on the infrastructure budget a few years ago, now, I know money was tight and stuff in the country at the time, but still, I don't think it begged the excuse where there was actually no money requested by the island section from the department. At least that's what I was told at the time, which I was actually shocked at, because regardless of whatever the budgetary confines were within the country, the budget heads were across government departments, the request should always go in to look for funding for the islands. So I would hope that never be repeated that again, and that the thinking across that needs to be expanded into a situation where the budgets that are looked for are realistic to achieve all the aims and objectives that we're talking about here today. So hopefully that mindset will shift, and I think the work of this committee could have a huge part to play in that. Thank you.
Deputy Karan is next.
Cathaoirleach, and thank you all very much for being here this morning, and to Aisling for your opening statement. Just to follow on from some of the issues there raised, particularly when it comes to housing, there's been an issue, I suppose, of a number of planning applications, we'll say, that I'm aware of, And typically one of the issues can be local need and showing you have a local need. I just wonder in particular, when there are people applying for planning permission, they get to that stage and they apply, what are the barriers coming back that's maybe refusing that planning permission in the first instance? In relation to the work that's underway by UCC, and that's obviously really welcome, I assume that will look at not just housing stock, but housing stock in relation to the amount of local authority houses, houses available for rent, and also vacant houses as well. When is that research due to be finalised? And I know you've said that you're hopeful that the Minister will look at that in relation to the policy plan that is coming for the islands, which I think has been delayed again. We're now being told that the Minister expects a draft to be ready for her consideration by the middle of this year, and that was a reply I got from her about 2 weeks ago. So I'd imagine obviously what you're seeking is for that same draft to be made available to yourselves, and this isn't the first time you've asked for that. So I just wonder, have you put that to the Minister or to the Department, and what has the response been in relation to sharing a draft with yourselves? In relation to broadband, obviously that is really important for all of us, and it is just as important for the islands. But in relation to the broadband connection points that are already available, and you say several islands have them, can you just give us a bit more information in relation to how many have, and is there plans or is any further work underway now in relation to the further rollout of the BCPs? And obviously you've mentioned the need for acceleration in relation to the broadband plan, and that's not something that seems to be happening right now. We know the revised target last year was missed as well, so there is concern there. And just then in relation to overall and the policy itself and all of the issues you've outlined today, what is your level of engagement with the Minister directly herself? Have you met with her? How many times have you met with her? What's that level of engagement like with the Minister? And then just lastly, in relation to energy, and I think it's certainly something this committee can push if a request for a meeting has gone in with Minister Ryan, and that meeting to date hasn't been forthcoming. But I suppose if the island's policy is published and it includes the need for island proofing, then schemes and everything else that come forward will, you know, we shouldn't have these issues if the island proofing was there in the first instance, when you have schemes like this coming forward that don't actually consider the added barriers and challenges for island communities, particularly when it comes to grants. And I think, as has been outlined by John, it was done in relation to the Department of Agriculture, and it could very easily be done for energy and for housing grants and everything else that relates to the mainland and the islands. That's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deputy Grant. And first,
Yeah, I can come in on that. Yeah, so thank you, Deputy Curran, and thank you for all your questions. On that, I'll try to answer them as comprehensively as possible. Yeah, we would be hopeful that the UCC research, we're just finalising doing working groups around the survey, and the guideline for that is that we'd have the survey completed by the start of the summer, and UCC would begin to do their analyse the data then thereafter. But we would definitely be hoping to have it somewhere for the middle of the summer, towards the end, kind of our AGM in September. So we'll definitely have it for that. But we would be hopeful that, you know, the survey, all the data will be collected by the time end of May comes around, because on islands, there's no point doing any kind of research or data collection around the summertime. So we'd be hopeful that we'd have all that done, and the UCC will be collating the data and analysing it for us then, and have the report soon after. So we're in line with the timeline for the policy document also, which will be very useful for it. And sharing a draft, I do believe, unless somebody wants to correct me, that we haven't had an official response in terms of in writing, but it was mentioned at the joint Oireachtas and the department were there, and I think, unless I'm mistaken, I think it was said that yes, they will share a draft with us. But again, maybe somebody else can clarify that up. And the reason we keep asking is, I suppose, there hasn't been anything in writing, but we have had engagement and good engagement, to be quite honest, with department officials, with Barbara Nikengas and Bríd Cnéile, and the department officials on the policy document. The minister herself, Comhdháil, has not met with regard to the policy document, but her officials, we did have a meeting back in the summertime, and and Bríd Cnéile is always available, and I think they're going to one more island now that things have opened up again. The BCPs, they're working quite well, and we do need acceleration in terms of BCPs are great and they're fantastic and they work well. I don't have the exact number of hubs that there are at the moment. Maybe perhaps one of my colleagues, I just don't want to give a figure that isn't 100% correct, would know. But we do need it going to the houses to keep us in line with the mainland, and some of the buildings, as we talk about on islands, are substandard when we look at these communal spaces. And there's also some other smaller islands that don't have a shared communal space. So there are certain challenges around that. We do welcome the BCPs absolutely, and it's a case of it's great to have something, but we would need something a little bit, people are looking for stuff now to go to their houses, as well as having BCPs to come out and work to. And it's the same, that's the same all over the country. And we would be hopeful that we could get the same response on it. I think that's as well as I can answer some of the questions. And if any of my colleagues want to come in on any of those, by all means, do.
Mr. Murray, I think, is indicating there.
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah, far ahead.
Yeah, Deputy Cran covered a lot of ground there, so if stuff wasn't answered, could you just come back with anything that wasn't answered there a few minutes ago by Aisling?
When people are putting in planning permission, I just wonder, is local need an issue as it has been in our area? And I just wonder, if not, what are the barriers when you actually go for planning permission? Why are people being refused? Or is it that people aren't going for planning permission in a lot of cases in the first instance?
Mr. Morden.
Yeah, maybe Simon might want to, but some of the issues are, there is local need. People are going for planning permission, and there's environmental issues. A lot of the islands are now in the SECs. There's a lot of environmental reports, which drives the price of planning up. So I know that, on one of the islands, properties that were close by each other, one had to get an environmental report and one had to get an archaeological report, and each of those reports cost no less than 1,500. And then one of the reports was done in March, so they were told to come back and know they had to do it in Bloom in May. And these kind of things don't get stated beforehand. So that means then that if you want to build, the timeline of it is that all your environmental reports have to be done in May. And again, this is a nuance to this one particular island. When we look at local need, there was an instance where a family of four, one of the people, one of the adults had previously lived in England and stated that he did own a house in England. So he was told that he had no local need, even though he'd been living on the island for the last 8 years, and had returned home to work in the area, to be in the area. So he then had to go and sell the house that he had in England to make sure that he could prove a planning local need. And that again increased cost and delayed the process when, logic would tell you there was a local need. His kids were in the school there. He was going to school there. He was an islander by birth. He had come back to live on the island and didn't realise that this would be an obstacle. And I'm sure so people are going for planning, and there's a lot of different nuances and a lot of different costs that are incurred as well. And I suppose one of the fine balances is we all want to protect the environment, but if there's no people living on it, we'll have wildernesses as well. So we have to find that fine balance between protecting the environment and the islands as very special places to live, but also ensuring that you can build on the island as well in a respectful manner.
Thank you. Just a couple of points that I'd like to make myself, and I'll bring in other members then that want to come in. But just first of all, I think there is the opportunity in terms of our islands to actually use them as pilot templates for some challenges that we have on the mainland in terms of e-health. And I recall being out in Ishboffin approximately 20 years ago when we were dealing with the health issues out there as a member of the Western Health Board. And, you know, there is an opportunity with the development of broadband now to provide very innovative new health tools, and I think the islands are an ideal template to use for the development of that technology. And yes, while there is an issue absolutely in terms of housing on the islands, there's also a challenge in terms of existing vacant property on the islands, and all of us right across the country see that firsthand in our own rural communities. And again, I think the islands could be used as a template to look at how we can overcome this particular challenge and replicate the knowledge then on the mainland. And again, in relation to the whole area of energy, I think there's huge opportunity there, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. Just to clarify one point that has been raised in relation to broadband, and the comment was made that there's no obligation to bring a fibre optic cable to the islands. Just let me make it crystal clear that under the National Broadband Plan contract, the default is fibre to every home. The contractor must justify why fibre is not being used in a particular scenario, but the default is fibre to every single home, regardless of location. Now, while the standard offering at the moment to every home is 500 megabits per second, which means that whether you're on an island or on the mainland, you have to get a minimum offering of 500 megabits per second, and that's absolute in the contract. I think it'll be very difficult to provide that without doing it through a fibre-based technology and solution. But let me make it crystal clear, the actual offering that is being delivered to every home at the moment is actually 10 gigabits. So potentially any home that is connected to the National Broadband Plan fibre cable today can, if they're willing to pay for it, get a 10 gigabit service. And I would expect that people on the islands would get the same opportunity to avail of that if they so wish. Now, that can only be provided through a fibre solution. And we as a committee will be holding the Department of Rural Affairs and the Department of Communications to that commitment. Just finally, if I could maybe focus my questions to Mr. Walsh in terms of the whole area of energy. It's an issue that is very close to my own heart. When I was appointed Minister for Energy in 2016, one of the first challenges that we had to deal with was the loss of electricity supply to Inisheer and Inishmaan. And I was on Inisheer and seen firsthand the challenges that were there and the generators that had to be brought in. And as Minister, I insisted, against the advice, I insisted on Ireland being one of the signatories to the EU Clean Islands initiative. And thankfully, and Mr. Walsh has referenced it, as has Ms. Morden in their initial contributions. And I think there is huge opportunity there in developing that initiative with the support of the European Union. But maybe, Mr. Walsh, if you could elaborate on what is happening in terms of the islands in relation to that initiative. You know, what type of technology is being used? What are the opportunities there for the other islands? And I think in that context, it's also important that when we're looking at electricity supply to our islands, that we're not just looking at supply coming from the mainland out to the islands. Because now with the development of our offshore renewable energy potential, there will be a significant amount of supply coming from the islands back into the mainland. And it is imperative that we look now at developing the cable network to our offshore islands that has the capacity to actually supply the mainland, rather than, which was historically the case, only supplying the demand on the islands. So maybe if Mr. Walsh could come back on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about this. Like, it is very close to our hearts in Comhdháil, and we do believe that the islands would be excellent test beds, especially for energy. So in the past few years, like, we're in the second kind of team for the Clean Energy for EU Islands. There was a team set up maybe 3 years ago, and they ran their 3-year contract, and there's a new team in at the moment. So in the first round, we actually did a lot of work with them, and I know down in the West Cork Islands, we had a number of webinars in 2020 trying to get the 7 West Cork Islands to work together. So we're actually working on that at the moment. But what it did, it actually brought a partnership together, and it kind of focused on the island. So we had Sustainable Energy Ireland working with us. We had Cork County Council's energy people working with us. And then we had the Clean Energy for EU Islands. So what it does for us, we find that when the Clean Energy for EU Islands, when you're talking to the likes of Sustainable Energy Ireland or the Council, when they see a European partner involved, it makes them more, or it's easier for them to step up. So like I said, we had Søren Hermansen, who would be the manager of the Samso Energy Academy, and Samso Island in Denmark would be seen as the energy island of Europe. And I suppose Søren Hermansen would be seen as one of the leading kind of advocates for renewable energy probably in the world. And again, he was saying that to make islands sustainable, this is the major issue. He said it's not anymore in the past, like we looked at energy, that it was a good thing to do and that we should do it. But no, it's an ultimate thing. Like you just, the cost of it is soaring, as we all know. And we have to bring this to Ireland. So the technology that we're looking at here, we actually work with Sustainable Energy Ireland, and I have to say they're a great organisation to work with. Like fabulous people there, and they know what they're doing. So we actually did an energy management plan, and we're supported by an energy mentor to do that. On the EU side of it, then we applied to the Clean Energy for EU Island Secretariat, and instead of a cash payment, they actually would give you experts. So experts in procurement, experts in different technology. So we're actually looking here, first of all, is the houses. Like, so we done a range of BR studies on houses on the island over the last few months, and then taking the information we got from there, we're looking at retrofitting houses. So the grants are after coming at the exact right time. But again, the issue of making it justifiable in islands, you just need that extra bit to make it work. We're also looking at technology. We actually have a dry dock on Bear Island, and they take in boats up to 50 metres, like for maintenance and painting. So they're actually after coming on board with us as a partner. So it's kind of a whole community. It's between the local authorities, the energy, the business community. We have UCC involved, and then we have the Clean Energy for EU Islands. So I think you need that mix again on the islands working. It's not something that one organisation can do on their own. So the dry dock, to actually dry the boats before painting, they're looking at a combined heat and power plant. They're already after putting, I don't know, 50 megawatts of solar on the roof, and I think they're actually doing more of that. We're also looking at wind, and we're also looking at technology that you can take heat from the sea through a heat pump type of system. So they're the kind of technology we're looking at, but it's huge. Like, even like there's talks about electricity cutouts over time. So like we're looking at microgrids, and that was a great way to get the support of Samso Energy Academy, because they have studies done on microgrids. Like there's microgrids on, like just for example, the marina and Samso that would suit a small island that has its own grid. And I agree with the chairperson there that we shouldn't always be looking at bringing power in. We should be looking at power out, and the cable system going to islands is out of date, and it does have to be upgraded if we're allowed to produce power and sell it. You know, there's communities that I visited in the Orkneys, in Denmark, in Sweden, that are selling power. Like there's one community in the Orkneys in they're actually selling the power, and it's actually paying for an out-of-hours ferry service, is paying for different projects on the island for different community and leisure facilities. So that's a great way to sustain the islands, I think. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. We're just discussing here, the members might think that, that income generated could pay for an air service. Anyway, Deputy O'Cahissy.
Garmagat the hÉireann. Dan, thank you very much for your opening submissions. I mean, the numbers are the starkest thing, Aisling, that jumped out for me, that reduction from 34,000 to 2,627. And I suppose at the root of the problem in terms of you getting representation is the small number of people that live on the islands, and then how fragmented you are across councils and different areas and different islands. So I suppose it makes it difficult to make the case stand up for you in terms of numbers. Just to say from in the previous session, one of the speakers, it could have been yourself, John, I'm not sure, recommended that members of the committee watch In a Shark Bus Oileáin. That's on the TG Car player. And I took that recommendation, and it really sets out, I suppose, in the starkest terms, the challenges of maintaining life on the islands, and it's well worth anybody watching. So a number of things jump out. I suppose I'll start with energy. It's maybe the one that sits most comfortably with me. There is huge opportunity. And John, if you're talking about microgrids, I'd be interested to know if you're looking at vehicle-to-grid options in terms of running power. So obviously storage is always a problem with renewables because of the intermittency. I know one thing you have plenty of on the islands is wind, but maybe not always. Are you looking at things like vehicle-to-grid storage so that if you got a couple of EVs on the islands, that would provide that kind of backup for you? Because the most valuable thing, yes, you should be energy exporters, but the most valuable thing that you can do is to keep the energy on the islands as much as possible. That's the greatest value add. So it's just something I'd be interested in hearing about. The chairperson referenced the potential for e-health. And I think e-health and e-pharmacy and e-prescribing, I think there's huge opportunities there. To come back to the housing issue, again, at a previous meeting, you referenced the Scottish Islands housing approach that they have there, and I did have a look at that. I'm not sure it directly maps, but certainly there's an awful lot that could be learned from it. The idea that jumped out at me was the empty homes officer, and the idea of having an empty homes officer. Now, I suppose I started by talking about fragmentation. I know each of the individual councils will have somebody within the housing department that will look at this kind of thing, but would it make more sense to you to have somebody having a role to look at all of the islands in terms of housing, rather than it being split into the various councils, whether that's something that would be benefit to? And the other thing that I just wanted to mention, so we're here to discuss this in the context of our Rural Future document. But I think there's three policies that kind of sit together, three legs of a stool. There's the Housing for All document, there's the Our Rural Futures document, and then there's the Town Centres First document, which was issued, I think, 2 weeks ago. And I wonder, is there an opportunity to apply that thinking to the islands? So I know by being titled Town Centres First, that might seem to exclude most of the islands. But that whole structure of building town teams, I mean, you could easily retitle those island teams, and I imagine they probably already exist on each of the islands. And I wonder, would that be a way of you accessing the type of support that's going to be available within Town Centres First, and particularly the support of a Town Centres officer, which is going to be kind of a key role within the Town Centres First structure at a council level? I wonder, is that something that would be useful for you to pursue in order to kind of, I suppose, make a little bit of elbow room in the Town Centres First document so that you'd be able to access those level of supports? Because I certainly think the community networks are already there, already in place. But it would be a shame if that, I suppose, third leg of the stool in terms of rural redevelopment was missed out on because you don't necessarily have town centres.
Thanks very much. Ms Morden, do you want to come in, or do you want to bat those questions off to someone else?
John, do you want to answer the energy one there first? Thank you, Deputy O'Coslick, and thanks for your comments and your questions. I think John and Simon might answer these ones.
So, Mr Walsh.
Sorry, I was muted there. No, definitely, like, we're looking at using the energy. Like, I think that was our first and foremost plan, was to use the energy on the islands. And even if you think about it, if you're producing energy and if you can offer people living on the islands cheaper energy, or if you could offer businesses cheaper or freer energy, that they would set up business on the island, it'd be a great way to attract new people onto the island and new business on the island. So that was one of our aims. Definitely the vehicles using electric vehicles. I know Cape Clear over the last number of years have been using electric buses as part of the local link scheme, and it's been very successful. And while being very good for the environment, the other side of it is, like, you don't have the hassle of bringing in fuel, petrol or diesel anymore, which is great. We were very happy to see under the CLAR fund there last week that there is a scheme now for electric vehicles, that islands can purchase electric vehicles for community use. And as part of that scheme, there was also funding available for PV panels or some technology to produce electricity. So I think that's going to be an excellent scheme for islands, and they're the type of schemes we look for. And we're delighted again that the department, brought that scheme out after consulting with islanders about it. So to answer Deputy's question, yes, we would be delighted to look at all sorts of technology for the transport system, and especially green ferries. In Denmark, the government there actually did a competition for people to come together to develop a green ferry. I know we're looking at green ferries on the islands. Like, we're actually looking to do a test case here with the dry dock that I mentioned, that they're looking to build a small electric ferry and maybe a small electric potting boat for fishing. So there's a lot of benefits coming down the line, I think, with renewable energy for islands. But again, we just have to be set up and ready for it.
Thank you. Mr Murray.
Yeah, I suppose just in the general context of the conversation so far, I suppose it's important to bring it back. Actually, something you said yourself there, Chair, about when you're out on Inishbofin, which was more years than we care to remember, as we met up that time when you were here. And I showed you the shoebox that was our health clinic, and the disgraceful clinic it was. Well, I'd just like to tell you, it's still the same one today. So, with a small bit of money spent to do it up, because somebody discovered there was asbestos in the ceiling of it. So there you go. So things like this, why do they take so long? We had a planning permission got for a new clinic. It was allowed run out by the HSC. I was shopping around for another site. At the time when you were here, there was a property up for sale. It was a turnkey property, but they wouldn't purchase the property. This is back to the housing situation. Why can't the council buy a turnkey property and house people immediately, besides going down the planning route? Excuses of trying to find funding, the never-ending story, and then the house never gets built. Things like this is, I suppose, there's a touch of Groundhog Day in some of the conversation we're saying, because as islanders ourselves and representatives of islands, we're saying a lot of the same things for a very, very long time now. And we're looking for solutions to these problems, ongoing solutions. I'm delighted to what you said there about the broadband, about the fibre, and that it is the preferred option. My fear is they'll find every excuse in the book how to tell us that they can't manage it for some reason. But as you know yourself, fibre optic is the solution, because broadband through wireless will have its limitations, always. Just in its capacity, first and foremost, but also under weather conditions. I suppose what we're trying to achieve here in the main is that when we're dealing with the Islands Division or any bodies that have a responsibility over the islands, that includes the minister, junior ministers, everybody, we're hoping that there's an expectation there, I suppose, at this stage, maybe wrongly so on our behalves, I'm not sure, that there would be a grasp of the understanding or a wish to grasp that understanding of island life and the difficulties and costs that are associated with it. So I suppose the options are, do we want people to continue living on the islands or do we not? If we do, there is a hidden cost, from the state's perspective. It will take funding to continue life on the islands. But you could argue that about any life across the country. But I mean, in our case, it's unique because what's the option? You go to, like our next door neighbour here, Inishark, depopulated in 1960, and many other islands up and down the west coast. I think the reference was already made in relation to the population collapse and how shocking that is. And I did recommend at the last meeting to watch Boss Hill on Death of an Island. Anyone that hasn't, I'd strongly recommend it. Just to give you some hint of what it's like for an island to end, and because we're in the position of trying to keep islands alive. But this is a documentary about what happens if an island's life comes to an end. And I think that's something that needs to be in the mindset of those that are in government authorities of any description in relation to try and help them. This is the objective. Don't let this happen again. And I would hope that that mindset is there and that there's a willingness to help the islands and the few that are left to keep our populations alive, because once they're gone forever.
Thank you. Ms. Moran.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy O'Cosdick, for all your questions there and for the information. There's huge potential with eHealth, and I think one of the best documents in recent years to come out of from government is the 2017 document on the primary healthcare in islands done by the HSE, and it was a huge consultation. It's been slow in its delivery, but we have seen definitely in the West Cork Islands, we have a West Cork Islands Health Forum now set up by the HSE, and there is movement on that. And the areas that we are focusing on down with the West Cork Islands is e-health and emergency management planning. Again, this touches on one of the other topics that you raised with fragmentation. We seem to be moving at a little bit of a quicker pace than perhaps some of the other regions. And as Comhdháil and the hÉireann, we'd like to see all islands move forward and progress on these kind of issues at an equal level and an equal pace. And one of the things that's so good about this document is the consultation was very detailed, and they sent out a consultant to each island, but they also did an implementation plan, and there seems to be a slight budget to back up what they're doing at the moment. So we welcome that, the e-health, the progress, and as you say, in terms of prescribing and in different ways of delivering different services, it will never, and this is one of the concerns of islanders, the e-health programme will never replace your nurse or your doctor, and it never can. And the HSE have said that the nurses or the doctors, that there are things that you need to be physically present for, definitely, but it can offer a greater range of services to the islanders. When you talk about fragmentation, in terms of the housing, I suppose it's a new idea and it's a welcomed idea, and I think that's what these conversations are good for, is for us gaining information from your knowledge in terms of an empty housing officer, and also in terms of the town's centre's first document, and maybe we can look at an island centre's first document, or look at ways of adapting that to suit the island's needs. So I think that's something that we're very grateful for, and we'll take away, and we might touch base with you again afterwards. We saw through the Leader programme and that when the islands are treated together, we do really, really well. Yes, there's nuances, but if you give us a programme where we deal with all of the islands together, it works well. So in previous Leader programmes, there was a lot just for the islands, and we saw great delivery and a high range of funding drawn down from Leader. Unfortunately, in just the last Leader programme, these lots were broken up into regions with different county councils. And an island, luckily for 3 of the islands, a company that dealt specifically with islands won the tender in 3 of them, but in one of them it didn't, and it just broke up the funding. The delivery
the islands didn't, I suppose, access as much money. So we would be requesting that a lot just for the new coming programme in Leader, and we've seen that it does work better. And you know, even in every area, in agriculture, in marine, in housing, if the islands are dealt with and we have a specific person to deal with the islands solely, they get a better understanding of it. And again, that's true for like SICAP. SICAP is delivered on, it's the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme. It's delivered on the Cork Islands, and it's a great programme. It gives an access to, you know, it's not a huge funding, but it does definitely increase the standard of living, and that's something that, like, you know, the SICAP programme does really, really well. It gives additional access to education, to programmes that, you know, enhance the quality of life. And an island SICAP programme or lot would be very much welcomed as well. So we can see that if we can keep things together for all of the islands, we do a little bit better out of. And I think that applying that to housing is something that perhaps we haven't looked into, and maybe it might come out of the, we never know what will come out of the report, but it's something that we need to look at, and I welcome that thought on it, Deputy O'Callaghan. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy O'Keefe.
Yeah. In relation to housing, if we divide it into two issues, there's the local authority housing, and then you have the issue of planning. Now, I think the quickest way we can deal with the issue of planning would be through the rural housing guidelines that are to come out soon, and I think we should take that up with the Minister, that on the island, permanent dwellers should, unless they own a house already, should be considered to have what's termed a housing need for planning purposes. And that should be across all islands and all local authorities, because the local authorities have to work within the national guidelines. So if you do it nationally, even though there are different plans in each county, you would have to incorporate that. And you can do it within existing structures, because we talk an awful lot in this country about changing structures, but often we waste a lot of time changing structures rather than making the structures that are there work to deliver what we want. The second thing, I think we'd all be supportive that Leader and SICAP would be done as previously through Oileáin or on a bid basis, but as an island lot. I think that's absolutely important. The third issue I'd just like to ask you about, my vision in terms of, well, two things. One, would you agree with the idea, since the biggest cost of putting cables into islands is the dredging cost, that there would be a coordinated approach to provide extra electricity connectivity, energy connectivity through electricity cables, the fibre cable, and in some cases even the water pipe at the same time, so that you get the one dredger in, and this has been done in other cases, and you actually survey the whole thing, you dredge the seabed, you put your cables in or your water pipe, and then you have the job properly done. And that this government centrally through the Islands Department are the only people who can put all of that together, and any necessary funding over and above what the agencies will be put in will be just put in by the government through the Islands Department. That's what it was set up to do. The second thing is, I was very interested in what you're saying about local networks. And since there's only one way of transporting electricity off an island, that's through your cable, it means that the air grid, basically, who control the whole flow of electricity in the country, could arrange with islands the following type of thing, that when they don't want island energy, that rather than turning off the wind generators, if you have them on the island, or whatever source of energy generation on the island, that would be used internally on the islands to effectively store electricity in very simple ways. One of them is to charge all the electric vehicles in the islands on the down periods with very, very cheap electricity. Effectively, you'd have your own electricity if you controlled your own generation. The second one is to heat all the houses, the water, and the houses in the winter time, so that all your heating costs would be done by storage, and you'd have it done when you had literally free electricity, that it's either turn off the generators, the wind generators, because they don't need it on the mainland, or to use it there. The third issue that I'm particularly interested in, and I understand there's a pilot project being looked at on one of the islands, is the use of hydrogen. Because hydrogen is a way of storing energy. And it would particularly be possible to use hydrogen. I understand there's a project going that will produce hydrogen from solar energy on islands. And the idea would be, as if you got hydrogen, I think the development of hydrogen technology, already you have buses in the city here and buses in lots of places that operate in hydrogen. So I think hydrogen technology is going to develop quite rapidly. It's a possible future energy source for aircraft, for ferries, as well as for other vehicles. And again, would you see that you will control your micro generation, that you'd export when you had surplus and the grid needed it, and that you would use, never switch off, that you'd use as much as you could for storing it on the island and having very cheap electricity, because if you have to turn it off, you're just sitting there doing nothing, to provide for people so that you could really dramatically reduce their heating costs, their transport costs, etc. And of course, the other big advantage has been pointed out, that you wouldn't be bringing any energy in the form of kerosene, of diesel or petrol, or very little into the island compared to what was happening in the, previously. The final point, can I ask you, and it hasn't been raised here, are you as shocked as I am that it would appear from the reply a minister gave to a parliamentary question I put down that you're not automatically included in the 20% reduction in public transport? I would have presumed that the islands would have been top of the list for that, since you cannot get in and out except by public transport, and that airfares for islanders and ferry fares would have automatically dropped to 20% at the same time that they're dropping on the 1st of April. It seems to me like an April Fool's joke a little bit early, that it wasn't automatically included in the government decision. I did raise the issue, and I'll be suggesting to the chair when the meeting ends that we immediately write to the minister and demand that there's equity of treatment for islanders in this particular case, as there's going to be for all the rest of the people in the state.
Just before you come back in, and when Mr Walsh comes back in, just related to what Deputy O'Keefe has said, I recall a number of years ago a pilot being done with Glendemplex with their quantum storage heaters that allow for electricity in and electricity out that can be controlled remotely. Of course, it does require broadband as well. But it might be an issue worth exploring, Mr Walsh, in terms of providing storage on the islands that would actually be provided in specific heaters in everyone's own home, and it might be a unique way to manage the excess electricity. So I don't know who wants to indicate first. I think Ashling's offline, so maybe I might bring in Mr Walsh first and then Mr Murray.
Okay, thank you, Chair. No, the technology at the moment, like there's houses here since we did our energy plan, there's houses here that have a PV system on their roof, and the technology, like the kind of brain that controls it all, like the first thing it'll power your house during the day, so you can use all your fridges, TVs, whatever. Then it will divert and it'll heat the water in your water tank to heat your water, which also benefits your heating system. Then it would go out and charge your battery system, your battery storage for the night. And then if you have an electric car, once that's done, then it'll charge up your electric car. So there's 2 or 3 people on the island now using that system. And for example, to go to Cork City, which is 85 miles each way from Bear Island, they're talking like €2 or €3 to run an electric car, but it's actually free from the sun. So like that technology is definitely there. Hydrogen is coming down the line. I'm aware of the projects that are going on with the Aran Islands, and I think a number of islands around Europe are involved in it. I think Rathlin as well is involved, and it's great to see that. And again, it's great. The islands are great as test beds, and we'll all learn from the work that they're doing. Hydrogen is a small bit off. Yet, like there's even solutions that we've seen in other islands where in the night time they pump water up on the cheap electricity and leave it down again, kind of a hydro system. So that works. But like even heating systems, I know of houses here that have the heat pump heating system all worked again from the sun and from storing electricity in batteries. And I think the battery technology is changing again to make things better again for us. So I think like the future is definitely bright for electricity generation. I think it will transform the islands. And just to back up Deputy O'Keefe's point again with the transport, when we did our energy master plan here, the ferry services and the marine transport services that are used on Bear Island, I think accounted for about 75% of our overall energy usage. So that definitely backs up the point. And we have that done by an independent consultant, if it's any use to back up the point about the transport fares. So that just proves that it is. And just the other point for Chairperson Naughton, we actually met the broadband of Ireland as Comhdháil on hÉireann, and they said, yes, we are supposed to put fibre to the home and we will do that on the islands. So every house on the island will be connected to fibre, but the connection between the island and the mainland won't be fibre. That's what they actually told us. So that might be something that needs to be looked at, to say you have to have a continuous line of fibre to get the, like you said, the 10 gigabyte, which will be needed for the future.
Yeah, and just before we bring in Mr. Murray there, the committee is meeting with National Broadband Ireland in the coming weeks, and we will be taking that specific issue up with them, as we've taken up with the department. We're aware of that issue, and they're talking about a point-to-point wireless service from the mainland to the island. The committee is unanimous in its view that should be done by a fibre optic cable directly to the island, not by a point-to-point service. Mr. Murray.
Yeah, just to come back on, I think most deputies have touched on it at the moment. It's in relation to, I suppose, the haphazard approach to, I suppose, the lack of island proofing, which is what we've a common theme from Comhdháil's perspective. And two of them have just been touched on there, the 20% reduction in travel, which did not, bizarrely, translate to the services, both sea and air, to the islands. And also we're talking about earlier the SEI retrofit grant, which didn't take into account the costs associated, considering the pressure there is on construction in this country and how hard it is to get people to do anything in the first place. And this grant now is going to make that even harder. But I mean, you'd start with the obvious thing with contractors on the island, because they're on the ground and they're local. You might have some chance of getting that work done by doing that, but to exclude them with the €1 million cap and the lack of a top-up to take into consideration the extra cost of islands. Well, I mean, there are two prime examples that have just been touched on in this meeting today, where island thinking is not being used, and we need to be considered, I suppose, and it is the work of the Islands Division to make this part, of everything that's happening through different grant systems and availability of any regulations in relation to island living, to encompass the islands as a lot, in the same with the LEADER programme. And if it's thought of in that context, that, does this work for the islands, or is there a nuance here that needs to be adapted to make this work for the island? To have that thought process at the start rather than always having to come in at the end, which is what we're doing now yet again, to try and backtrack or backwalk what's just been done to make it adaptable in the island context. And it's frustrating for islanders. We're looking at this document here, which came out in 1996, which was the island's development document done at the time. And now we are, whatever it is, 26 years later, trying to do the next phase of that, to update it, so to speak. I think that's a huge gap in itself. But it has to be to the forefront of the thought process, where islands are dealt with in a lot capacity. And that, like the SAI, like the 20% reduction, why wasn't that automatically thought of? Well, this is going to be a problem in the islands. If the contractors can't meet this threshold, well, then we'll adapt it, like John mentioned with the Department of Agriculture grants. It doesn't take a lot to do it. I think Deputy O'Keefe said it. You don't have to change all the regulations. You just need to do a little bit of tweaking with the regulations that are there to bring it into the context of island living. And that's across everything. That's across planning for housing, that's across the health situation, and that's across what Deputy Naughton himself knows, Chair, in relation to communications and especially in relation to broadband. And I think if through the work of this committee and the interdepartmental committee, that's driven home, you know, and that is one of the main legs of the stool that comes out of this whole conversation, that islands are thought of in the process and all the processes in relation to anything that's required, then I think that's probably the best achievement that could come out of all of these conversations, and that we don't go back to another 25 years of trying to just always remind people, you know, hello, there are islands off the coast, there are people living on them, and we'd like that to continue, because that's kind of where we are at the moment. You know, there's been a lot of work done, a lot of talk, and then a big gap with nothing. And now we need to get back to getting work done across the islands in every capacity. But also the powers that be, wherever it's government departments, county council, you know, SCI, it doesn't matter where it's coming from, but they would consider the islands in the context of, you know, whatever is coming forward at the time. So hopefully that we can drive that home and get that thought process going and get it to continue, and that islands will be constantly thought of, you know, and not forgotten again. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mr. Morden. Mr. Walsh, it would be useful if after the meeting you'd furnish that information regarding the transport costs so that we can include that in the correspondence that will be drafted on foot of this meeting in relation to the government decision. Can I just put a final question to you, and I don't expect to have an answer now in relation to it, but if Comhdháil could come back, I would appreciate it. And that's in terms of the utilisation of infrastructure when it is put in place. Now, this is not unique to the islands, but I think there was a golden opportunity to exploit this on the islands, and I don't know whether that has happened. And that is my predecessor as Minister, Minister Pat Rabbitte, rolled out high-speed broadband network to every single post-primary school in the country, including on the islands. And I know, having spoken with some of the teachers on some of the islands, and asking them, you know, has the range of subjects been increased as a result of that, allowing for remote teaching? I accept that you can't do it in terms of practical subjects, but it does provide an opportunity for students on our second level, in our second level schools on our islands, to have a broader range of subjects. I have a particular problem in the other part of Galway, in East Galway, where we have a lot of small second level schools as well, and it limits the range of subjects that students can have. So my question is, on the islands, have we seen with the introduction of high-speed broadband in the post-primary schools an increase in the range of subjects being offered to pupils at junior level cycle and at senior level cycle where they are being taught remotely? And maybe you could come back to the committee with an answer to that in the not too distant future, because from my experience on the mainland this hasn't happened. And it really needs to be driven by the Department of Education, working with the education authorities and the ETBs to ensure that there is a broader spectrum of subjects offered to students in the smaller second level schools across the country. So can I thank you, unless there's any final comment that you want to make? Can I thank you for your contributions today? Again, very constructive and very positive engagement with the committee. We will be in private session after this meeting going through a number of the issues that you've raised and following those up, and we will come back to you with the response that we receive. The committee has also invited Minister Humphreys and our officials to a future meeting where we'll raise these very points again and concerns that you've raised with us this morning. Furthermore, it is my intention as Cathaoirleach for this committee to visit and hold a formal meeting on one of our offshore islands to meet with the people on the ground on a number of the islands and get a feel firsthand for their concerns before we prepare our final report for Minister Humphreys. And we'll hope that this feeds into the Department's action plan for island development when it is published, hopefully as soon as possible. So Garavil of Mahagut Galer, and thank you for your time this morning. The Joint Committee will now proceed in private session and remain until it is adjourned. Go to Mahagut.